Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the World of Momos podcast. And on this edition of Reflections and Reactions, we have a very special guest for you. We have Gavin Ashenden, and we are going to talk about um, Christian faith itself, the what I see as folly of interfaith projects within Christian churches, and also what threats do Islam pose to the Western world. But before we do that, what would be really good for people who don't know Gavin is for Gavin to tell us a brief, sort of like a brief life story. His life is very
Yes.
interesting. So I'm not sure how brief we can be about it, but it would be really good for people to listen. So hi there, Gavin. How are you?
Well, it's great to meet you, and what an interesting journey you've had too. I'll try and be as brief as I can, and then that way, if there are things you want to open up, we can do that rather than have me be tedious and boring. Um, I was always very confused about God. In fact, in my teenage years, I decided to live 1 year as an atheist and 1 year as a Christian to
Mm,
see what the difference was. And essentially, it seemed to me that it was about generosity for a teenager. So when I was not a Christian, I felt no moral obligation to be generous to people. When
mm,
in the year that I was a Christian, I felt an obligation to be generous, and I thought that, I mean, I wasn't a very deep teenager, although I was very, I was profoundly touched by the mystery of simply being alive. I couldn't work out why for the whole of history I wasn't, and suddenly for a brief moment I was, and then for the rest of history I wasn't going to be again. I thought that was a really serious conundrum, and I was a bit surprised that nobody else was disturbed by it. But on the other hand, I was so interested in things. I wanted to postpone getting to know God. I think the next thing that happened was about 19. I drunk myself to death, which sounds
mm,
a little bit, obviously, it's a bit hyperbolic, but I didn't know anything about near-death experiences, though now I do. But I drank a liter of vodka, and I had the impression that I left my body, went to be judged. The experience of judgment was immensely serious. But one of the impressions I had was that I was grateful that there was a judgment, because I thought this proves there's justice in the world. And I might get sent to hell, but I'll have the satisfaction of knowing there's justice, which was an odd
mm.
thing for a 19-year-old in the middle of a whatever happens when you drink a pint of vodka. And I would say I met God. I met I met a light who was more than light. God was singular and plural. God was kind, and the court withdrew, and for half an hour, and then came back and pronounced that I would be set back again. The reason I think I can't think of anything in my background that would have prepared my unconscious to play out such a drama. And the reason I think it might have happened was because normally I have no resistance to alcohol. It poisons me. I'm very bad with alcohol. So a pint of vodka would have made me very ill. But when I came round, instead of being nauseous and drunk and hungover, which I would have been for days, and running to the toilet, I felt remarkably well, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And I thought, my goodness, this thing happened. And then the next thing that was that I had this amazing sense of forgiveness. And I thought, in a fairly primitive way teenagers do, what can I do to keep this? Well, I simply have to pass it on. The night before, I was teaching music in North America, and I'd had a fight with our boss who was stealing our money. And so my other student musician colleague said, "Gav, you have the biggest mouth and the shortest temper. Go and get our money from him." So I ended up, after arguing with him, picking him up and shaking him by the lapels and banging him against the wall until he said, "I'll give you your money." Now, it was successful in that we got paid, but it upset me dreadfully. So the next day, I felt I had to go and find him and ask him for forgiveness for banging him against the wall, even though it was not unjustified. And then it was like a Laurel and Hardy movie. I saw him come out of a building. I I sped up to catch him. He thought I was chasing him. He ran, I ran. I finally caught him and started shaking him by the lapel again and saying, "Look, I've come to forgive you," which was a bit counterproductive. But moving on to more serious things, I then didn't bother with God after that. I thought, well, I now know God exists. I don't know who he is. I don't know which flavor he is, but I know he's there. And I'll get on with my life. Except that a couple of years later, I had a very seriously depressed girlfriend who was mentally ill and kept on trying to kill herself. And I thought I had no idea what I could do to help her. So in a rather simplistic way, again, I thought, what happened last time? There was a real, oh yes, God. I'd forgotten all about God. At this time, I was training to be a lawyer at a law school, and there was a mission to the university. A man came to talk about Jesus. I went to listen to him, and I thought the Jesus that he was representing was very like my experience of the light. Jesus said, "I'm the light of the world. Only I can forgive sins. I'm the resurrection and the life." And I thought, well, actually, this is about as close as you could get to a character profile for my encounter. But I was very hesitant about being trapped by somebody else's manipulative religion. And so I decided I would convert provisionally for periods of 48 hours at a time. And during the 48 hours, I would read the New Testament, I'd say my prayers, I'd adopt higher ethics, and then see what it looked like after every 48 hours. And after a while, I began to think, this is very good. This is real. No one is getting at me. I like what I see in the Gospels. I'm getting to like Jesus a lot. This is a way of life. Then I thought, well, we need more Christian lawyers. So I was looking forward to being a lawyer. But then something happened, and I felt I needed God's permission for the rest of my life, and I didn't feel I had it. So I spent a year as an itinerant musician saying my prayers. And during this year, I had an overwhelming sense I needed to be an Anglican vicar. I didn't really like the idea of the institutional church. I was a bit reluctant, but it would mean doing another degree in theology and philosophy. That appealed to me. So I presented myself to the church. They accepted me, and I then trained to be an Anglican vicar and became a curate in East London, where in just south of Tower Bridge, where I was for 3 years, and then I became a vicar on a South Croydon housing estate for another 7 years. I did 10 years as a vicar, and always with a sense I didn't quite fit in. But my communities grew, and during that time, my bishop paid for me to do some postgraduate work. So I did a degree in religious psychology with the Jesuits at London University. And then I went on to do a PhD, and I got a job as a lecturer in the psychology of religion and a senior chaplain at one of our more radical universities, where I then worked for the next 25 years. And during that time, I had a team of chaplains, including Jews and Muslims, and learned a great deal from my colleagues. And then a number of things happened during that period. I fell in love with Carl Gustav Jung, partly because the dominant intellectual pressure in the society I worked in was Sigmund Freud. So I was surrounded by atheists in this radical university, and all of them really were influenced by Freud in one way or another. And Freud and Jung were colleagues. They took an entirely different view towards religion. I became increasingly Jungian, and I lectured on Freud and Jung in university. And I found Jung very appealing. Now, the reason this matters is because Jung has become the psychological and ethical foundation of the society we now live in the West, which is all about self-fulfillment, a degree of relativity, the importance of spirituality, unlike Freud, who thought it was an illusion. And I I became more of a Christian Jungian than of a Jungian Christian,
Hmm.
because there is a difference between Jung and Christ, and uh, I was beginning to find Jung more attractive, which was a mistake. But one of the things that happened during the 1980s, I had smuggled Bibles into the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, and I had read a lot of Solzhenitsyn and become very familiar uh, with Marxist-Leninism. And I'd got arrested by the KGB and interrogated rather roughly, and had a great deal to do with underground Christians. So I knew, and it was a great surprise to me when the wall came down in 1989. But one of the things that happened around about year 2000 was I had a very odd experience, which was that if you can imagine that this totalitarian regime had a taste or a smell, I mean, they don't, but let's just think for a moment that they might do. It was as if I could taste or smell it in the air. And I went, whoa, that's crazy. It's finished. It's over. Fukuyama says that the end of history has come. It's just about liberal democracies at the moment. But I was overwhelmed by this extraordinary impression, and I thought, it's back. I don't know what it is, but it's back. And so I began to read around, and I came across the Frankfurt School and the whole notion of cultural Marxism. And at the same time, I lectured in monotheistic mysticism, which was a postgraduate course looking at Islamic, Jewish, and Christian mysticism, similarities and differences. And one of the things that happened was I became friends with some of my Muslim colleagues, who began to say that really we've come to this country with the ambition of turning it into an Islamic republic, and we think we're doing very well. It's going to happen sooner than we think, and sorry about that. I thought this was a bit of hubris, until I began to look at the figures and noticed that some of the things they said, that there were half a dozen cities in the north where the Islamic population under 15 was over 50%, and that was going to have demographic as well as democratic implications. And essentially, they said, we very much like Tony Blair's idea of mayors, urban mayors. There'll come a point where urban mayors in Muslim majority cities will ask for Sharia law or something equivalent to it. And the democratic pressure to develop a Muslim legal culture will become overwhelming, and so some of the country will become Islamic. And I could see that was true. However, so in about, I suppose, 2005, I saw a form of cultural left-wing totalitarianism coming, and my Muslim friends were kind enough to alert me to the growth of Islam, and Islam was becoming increasingly muscular and ambitious. And in the middle was Christianity. And I thought, well, this is very interesting. We have a three-way fight here. So I happened to think that, well, I had this great sense that my freedom of speech was under threat, and that both Islam and cultural Marxism were going to curtail my Christian freedoms. And so I began to think that I really need to work for the renewal of Christianity in the face of these two inhospitable ideologies. The problem was that my university was becoming increasingly woke, and I realized that I was going to get sacked if I stood out against the left woke culture. In fact, in my academic department, there was a very famous, she's become famous now, lesbian professor of philosophy, who mainly withstood my attempts to develop courses with Christians at the heart of them, particularly the Oxford Inklings, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and so on. And I resigned in my late 50s because I didn't want to get sacked, thinking, well, she's going to be fine. Quite extraordinarily, she was driven out of the university a few years later as a TERF, as a trans-exclusive radical feminist, by the trans lobby. So it turned out that this this paragon of left feminist virtue became a casualty of the culture wars, whereas I sidestepped it by resigning a bit earlier. And I mean, I say that only to give an example of how serious the culture wars were. If a very clever, attractive, interesting, energetic lesbian professor of philosophy gets drummed out of the university for not being
Mm.
left enough, then that's an example of how serious the culture wars have become, and also how problematic the issue of free speech is on the left. Well, you will know what happened to immigration since I left. I resigned in about 2012, 12 years ago. And so both these other movements have become more energetic and more ambitious for the public space in our country. And Christianity has imploded, partly because it's tried to make an accommodation with relativism. And Anglicanism began to give itself to feminism, and I saw feminism as being really the if you like the tool that broke open the gates of Christendom, because after feminism became third wave feminism, came gay marriage, became trans rights, is becoming pedophilia, but it was the presuppositions of feminism that laid the foundation for this extraordinary development of progressive morality to take place. And Anglicanism had no answer. And about that time, I began to think that not only was Catholicism true, but that it was the only philosophy that would stand up to it. But the reason I became a Catholic was not just because of that, but two things happened which changed my view of the truthfulness of Catholicism. The first one was that as a good Jungian, I'd given up believing in the devil. Instead, I believed in the shadow and the interworking, the interrelatedness of good and evil, rather than their objective polar opposites. And I had a terrible experience of evil, which lasted 3 nights. And a friend of mine was a Roman Catholic exorcist. And I said, John, what can I do? This is driving me mad. This is the despair, the oppression, the darkness, the threat is, and the sleeplessness is terrible. I think I'm going mad, but it may not be that. It may be evil. And as an exorcist, he said, yes, I'm very sorry. It is evil. I said, well, what can I do? And he said, well, you can talk to Mary and pray the rosary. And I said, well, I know quite a lot about Mary, particularly in Middle Ages, but I'm not sure I'm willing to do that. So he said, well, it's your choice. You can put up with it, or you can ask for her help. So I did ask for help, and I began to pray the rosary, and I was astonished at the immediate change that took place. Then I became very interested in Mary, and I discovered her apparitions, and I began to go through them one by one to see how they were, starting with one in North Spain at Garabandal in 1963, because I was 9 at the time. And I thought, well, if I was 9, then there'll be cameras and scientists and skeptics and people around who won't be taken in by medieval Catholic piety. And as I looked at some of the videos of this with a psychologist member of faculty, one of the things she said that she said, well, what's going on? And I said, well, notionally, these children are having an encounter with the Virgin Mary. And she said, well, whatever those children tell you, you can rely on. And I said, well, how do you know that? And so, because we've done a number of interesting studies on pre-adolescent children, and they can't fake ecstasy. And one of these children are clearly in an ecstatic state. And whatever produced it, it's not done by somebody to them, and it's not done by themselves. And so if they're saying they're seeing Mary, and they had this extraordinary facility of crossing themselves in complete synchronousness, then she said, you should take that seriously. As I ultimately looked at the other apparitions, and I came to believe that Mary was real and that the Catholic Church had been renewed by Mary. And then I discovered the Eucharistic miracles, where a host that had fallen to the floor in a church in Buenos Aires in 1994 was put away by the priest and left in a cup. and it began to bleed in the water it was put in. And everyone was very confused by this, so they kept it locked away until the bishop said, send it to a laboratory in New York, where they did tests on it, and the laboratory said this is human tissue from the heart. This is living human tissue with white cells. Where did you come across living human tissue with white cells to give us a sample? Because we may need to call the police. And so they said, well, this is a host that's been in a cup of water for 5 years from South America. And then, because only in '94 was the technology available to do this kind of thing, this replicated. Indeed, there have been bleeding hosts for a very long time. One of the earliest ones in the 6th century in Italy, and I'd always taken them for overwriting, for hyperbole, for people who believed more than they, whose belief, I suppose, had led them into a degree of credulity, only to discover that science says something different. Interestingly enough, science has just done the same thing with the Shroud of Turin. So in about the 70s or 80s, they did some carbon dating from the shroud. But the thing is, the shroud had been mended in the Middle Ages after a fire. And so one of the things they had to make sure was that they didn't test the medieval repair. But apparently they did. So they've done another test in the last year, only to discover that it is indeed carbon dated back to the 1st century. So one of the things that science has done in both those cases is to confirm what the Catholic Church has said about itself. And so with the way in which Anglicanism was giving way to the relativism of the present culture, and my discovery that things that I'd taken to be superstitions in the Catholic Church were actually miraculously true, and the fact that only the Catholic Church appeared to have the courage and the longevity and the sort of confidence in what it was to challenge both Islam and wokeness, that I became a Catholic, so that brings me to today.
All right. So, just for continuity reasons, to let everyone know how I've changed my clothes all of a sudden in the middle of the episode, we were recording previously. So, whatever you've heard so far have been recorded previously, but then there was a problem with the connection. So, we're meeting up again another day, which is today, and we're recording the rest of the episode. So, we are going to pick up where we left, and there was one thing that I wrote it down somewhere. I think so. I remember it. It's something that you were telling me about when you were telling me about your life story. Telling us about your life story was the regret that you felt once you encountered someone. I think so, physically, right? And even though that person was at fault, you felt like you had to go back and apologize. And something like that happened to me very early on as well in my life. um and it wasn't a part of a Muslim nature at that time. I was young. I think so, I was in 6th grade or something. And it's not as if like that was nurtured in Islam or anything like that, that sort of feeling. But I had that feeling, and I've found that in my later life that I've had that, because I associate those feelings with Christianity a lot. And I've had that sense that, I've had a Christian feeling all my life without knowing Christ, right? Do you think those feelings are connected to Christianity, and it has come through, it has embedded into us for so long that for most people it's become second nature to them?
Oh gosh, well, there are lots of elements to that, and
Hmm.
it's really quite a difficult question. So let me first of all say that this need to forgive the person that I'd had a confrontation with the night before, it was his fault in the sense that he was defrauding us.
Hmm.
My fault in the sense that I let my anger and frustration get out of control. But the reason it happened was I'd had this near-death experience during which I'd appeared to have been taken to some kind of heavenly court, some cosmic
Hmm.
place of judgment. And after serious examination and consideration, for reasons I don't understand, I'd been forgiven. All
Hmm.
I knew was I'd been forgiven. And it was such an I didn't know Jesus,
Mm,
the Godhead, the light, the experience didn't leave a visiting card with his name on it. But the experience of being forgiven was so real that, first of all, when I came to, my body and soul reconnected. Um, as I said, after having been blind drunk, not at all drunk, but extremely well, my
mm,
sense was, how do I keep this sense of being forgiven? It's just a glorious,
mm,
amazing, clean, fresh, hopeful. How do I keep hold of this? And instinctively, something inside me said, only by passing it on, only
mm.
by giving it. And it's always been clear to me as a Christian, you can't give what you haven't been given. And so
That's good.
if you have to
Yeah.
forgive, if you need to forgive someone who's hurt you, and we all find ourselves being constantly wounded, both by people we know and also by people we don't
Mm,
know.
mm,
Movements, organizations, other religions,
mm,
people who threaten and frighten us uh, and denigrate us. The calls on forgiveness are enormous, but we can forgive insofar as we've been forgiven. And the great one of the great purposes of being a Christian is to know Christ so well
mm,
that as we confess our sins to Him and we experience His forgiveness, we pass it on to others. One of the reasons I became a Christian was several years later on, when I was having a crisis and I was looking for God, and I was
mm,
presented with Jesus as a possibility of the living God. It was
mm,
precisely His character of
mm,
forgiveness and that made me think, I wonder if this Jesus has anything to do with the cosmic principle of intimacy who forgave me. If he's
mm.
at all like that, maybe he is who he said he is. Maybe he
Yeah.
is the way, the truth. Maybe he is the incarnate Son of God. And so it was that working hypothesis that
Mm.
led me to take the first step of faith. I
Would I
trust.
be wrong? Would I be wrong in saying like forgiveness? It because people see these things within Christianity as a weakness, but because I think so, it's because of their own insecurity, to be unable to feel these things deeply. Um, I don't think so. It's a weakness. I think forgiveness doesn't mean that you disregard injustice. Is that
Absolutely not.
you deal the required punishment or required actions that are needed, but then you ask for forgiveness because it's a feeling like I shouldn't have had to do that, like so that sort of thing, that it's not something that I enjoy. And that's the feeling that came up to my mind when I was in sixth grade. There was this boy. We were in the class and he was teasing this other boy, and he was saying derogatory things about his mother and stuff like that, and he felt very helpless, sorry.
Mm,
And I just had to act, right. I acted. It wasn't something done on me. If it was something done on me, I could have just forgiven that person and went on, because that was my nature since I was a kid. But it
mm,
was being done to someone else, and I had to act. And I remember um being so angry and grabbing that kid by the throat, that other kids had to push me off, because I didn't realize that I was really choking him like to death,
yeah.
basically. And then the next day when I came to school, because people didn't they didn't regard me as that sort of person, because I wasn't a confrontational person, I wasn't a bully or anything like that, but it's just I acted in that way. And the next day he came in, and I could see that person was still afraid of me, right. And that made me feel really bad, because I already wanted to reach out to this person and ask for forgiveness. And when I saw that person flinch when I approached that person, it just made me aware of, like, this is not how it should be. So I approached that person, that kid, and I just apologized. I said, I'm really sorry I acted out like that, but you're behaving in that way, and it's not nice to act in that way and stuff like that. And then we became friends for some
That's
reason.
lovely.
But it's not really the Muslim way of doing things, to be honest.
No, no, I know it. I know it isn't. And
Yeah.
in one sense, being a Muslim is easier and sometimes more attractive because
Mm,
one of the issues that we find ourselves dealing with is a sense of justice. and a sense of
Mm.
right and wrong. And it's when our sense of justice has been offended that we want to make
Yeah.
some kind of we want to take some kind of revenge or impose justice on people. It's one
Mm.
of the reasons why you can't forgive people who haven't offended you personally. The
Yeah.
whole this whole woke business
Mm.
of reparation for historical injustices
Yeah.
is a complete misreading of the relationship between justice, forgiveness, and the original. I
Mm.
can only forgive people who've offended me, and I'm
Mm.
not the guardian of cosmic justice because I'm
Mm.
as flawed morally as the people who need my forgiveness. So
Mm.
I'm not entitled to impose justice on people. I may want to articulate justice and to
Mm.
defend justice, but I can't impose it on people. And one of the
Mm.
reasons why forgiveness is so important is because ultimately, it's like it's this chain that Jesus described when he said, there was a rich man who was forgiven all his debt by his debtor, and he goes out and finds someone who owns a little money, and instead of being passing on the generosity, he imposes justice improperly, and where he had no right to do it. So one of the beauties of forgiveness is not it's not a weakness at all, because the thing that's most strong is rage and resentment and revenge. They're immensely strong in the human
Mm.
experience. It's an incredible strength to be able to overcome rage, resentment, and revenge. Much stronger to break them with forgiveness, but it can only be done when we've received it from God Himself.
Yeah, I mean, I've been. It's been a long time. I've been thinking about resentment a lot, and for me, it's one of the most poisonous emotions in a human being because it makes a soul corrupt so deeply that you become blinded, and only after you have acted upon those resentment, only afterwards you realize what you have done, and by that time it's too late, and then you spend generations of your life trying to of your people's life trying to ask forgiveness for those actions, and you just end up causing more harm. And the, well, just leading on from that, and the reason why I've been thinking about it a lot as well is because I feel like there's a sense of loss of religion in not just religion, a sense of loss of spirituality itself, right? Because we can have higher numbers of Christians going to churches, but none of them knowing the wisdom of Christ.
Mm.
We will still end up with similar issues, or even worse issues, because they will have the conviction of they think that they're doing the right thing without knowing what they're doing, by just a sense of connectivity of us to something greater than us, right? We are, it seems like we are worshiping this materialism that we are so um we just want, like we just care about the things that we can possess, rather than the relationships that we can create and the emotions that we can spread between each other. And there is a revival. It seems like there's people are trying to revive the sense of Christianity back in England, but what I mostly see is people shouting, or even beyond England, in the other Anglosphere, in America as well, people just shouting Christ is King. And I find like most people who are shouting Christ is King, Christ is King, do not really understand the wisdom of Christ, because they're acting out. When they say it at a point to win an argument, and they're exhibiting pre-argument, they're exhibiting traits which are unchristian. So it just shows to me like, you're just not acting on the wisdom of Christ. Also, like, just to add on to that as well, because there was a thing that someone actually said to me, that the people on the political left or whatever, on the woke left, they're beyond help, just leave them be. And I told them, like, I reminded them of the parable of the sheep, you know and I was like, but that person had like Christ is King, and like, the sign of the cross on their profile and stuff like that. And that is where that feeling of mine came from. It's like, well, you're not really understanding uh, the stories in there, the wisdom of the stories in there. The parable of the sheep explains to you why the recovering one lost sheep, the joy of recovering one lost sheep, is more than the sheep that you already have. Like, those are the lost sheep, they are the lost souls, and we need to recover them. we might have a problem with recovering them. They might resist. Obviously they'll resist. They are sheep. They're gonna try to flock away and stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that our purpose should stop, or we should change our purpose because it's hard, because the path is hard.
I think you're right. Being a Christian often seems to me like walking a tightrope. It's very hard to keep your balance between competing forces. And very often the sloganizing people you described have given way to the lust for power.
Mm,
If people won't hear what we want to say or won't do what we want to do, it's such a temptation on this high wire, this tightrope, to put pressure on them, which is essentially the
mm,
use of power. And sometimes shouting at people, sloganizing at people, rebuking people is the giving way to power rather than to prayer. Jesus never did that. He lost his cool with the Pharisees sometimes, but it wasn't in order to force them to behave in a different way. It was he raised his voice to try and get through to them about the incongruity of their situation, whitewashed sepulchres. But Jesus never used power. He used instead, he tried to develop people's hunger for what he
mm,
had to give. And it seems to me that the authentic Christian position is always to try and deepen people's hunger for what Christ brings, rather than to use force or power. The two alternatives, Nietzschean politics of the hard right or hard left, and Islam, very quickly resort to power because it's effective and it's rather
mm,
satisfying. What the Christian does instead is to turn the other cheek. He soaks up evil and he tries to exacerbate the appetite of his opponent for all that is good, to make him more hungry for the good than frightened of the power. It's almost as if we have, all of us inside us, we have two sets of hungers. There is if you like, there's an addict who wants revenge and power, and every time you
mm.
deal in it, you feed the addict. And then the true soul who wants the character of God, the character of Christ. And what's important is that we feed the hungry soul rather than the power addict. And the trouble is, the more you feed the power addict, the hungrier he gets. And that's a
Yeah.
tightrope. That's a tightrope in the spiritual life. Always to feed the soul with the fuel of Christ rather than the addict with the other side.
Do you feel like the problems that we have right now in England, the societal problems that we have right now, are mainly down to the lack of Christianity, or is it like compounded on certain things as well, or is it just that people have been pushed too far, and they've just they're just acting out as normal people would? Because I always feel like it usually happens in these circumstances. When you push a people too far, they're obviously going to build up resentment, and after out they're going to act on their resentment. And Christianity, I've been leaning on Christianity for a long time now because of this reason, because I see that it balances those emotions, and tells people, even when there's justice needs to be dealt out, that you will deal it but go no further. Like, it acts as that barrier.
You can't move.
But without it, I feel like without it, Britain will lose its soul, and it will do, irreparable damage to itself.
So it partly depends on what problems you're describing, but it's the you can't. There is no vacuum. There's no moral and spiritual vacuum.
Mm,
You either fill the public space and the imagination and the culture with aspects of God and that which flows from God, or with perversion and perversity. And I mean, if you look at Nazi Germany, the moment you get that, what flooded in then was hatred and perversity. If you look at
mm,
decadent culture, it's hatred and perversity again. What keeps hatred and perversity from the human heart? Well, only the culture of Christ does.
yeah.
And I'm afraid, I think what's happened is, if you get rid of Christ, then there are two other forces which are making a bid for the human imagination. One is political power and the other is religious power.
Mm,
Islam comes offering religious power, actually
Mm.
with a mix of political power alongside it. And then the totalitarian politics offer political power. The only thing that keeps totalitarianism and Islam at bay is Christian culture and Christ himself. But in our culture, we've turned our back on Christ. We've got rid
Mm.
of him, and so there's this vacuum, and into this vacuum is flowing political totalitarianism and religious totalitarianism. Essentially, the politics of the left and the right, the politics of of totalitarianism, and ultimately Islam. And in fact, what's going to happen, of course, is that Islam and the left are going to find themselves fighting each other once they've crushed Christianity, and that's going to happen in from I think probably from 2032 onwards.
Mm.
Um, so we can expect the kind of a tightening of the woke left grip in our culture over the next 7 years or so. And then at that point, Islam will have grown to the point where it can challenge it. And the left will find themselves very surprised that they're dealing with Islam. And they misunderstand Islam. They think of Islam as a kind of Arabic Christianity, but it's nothing of the kind. It has a very different character,
Mm.
and they've badly underestimated it. I think Islam will win.
Mm.
I see if we're left, if nothing changes, I don't see how
Yeah.
anything could stop the Islamification of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, this is what worries me as well, as someone who was in that faith and got out of that faith because of these reasons, because of their violent nature and the corruption. Basically, I find it like, I read it a lot and studied it a lot. It took me a while to leave Islam, because I wasn't forced to leave Islam. It wasn't restricting my life, because I didn't like doing those things. Like most of the times when you hear ex-Muslims and stuff, and they say, "Oh yeah, because I couldn't drink, I couldn't party, I couldn't." It's like I drank every now and then, but it wasn't essential. These things were not essential to
Mm.
me, right? So I was a very, like, quiet sort of spiritual sort of person, anyways, to begin with. But I just found that it was complete corruption of Abrahamic faith. It wasn't a continuation of Abrahamic faith.
Mm.
And when I came over here, so I'm coming to the point of interfaith religious projects within Christianity, because I think so that's one of the arms how Marxism has used to subvert Christianity or Christian churches in England, and basically destroyed it. What we see Church of England now converted to, it's not Christianity anymore. It's
Mm.
just a religious arm of woke ideology now. And these interfaith things, I just couldn't understand. When I came to England, I just couldn't understand, well, why are you doing it? Here's a set of people who deny Christ. You think, oh no, we believe in Christ as well. They don't believe in your Christ. They believe in their Christ. They believe
Yeah.
in Isa. They don't believe in
Yes.
Christ, you know and they deny Trinity. That's the foundation of your faith, and you're welcoming them as a valid faith in your house. Now, that's not Christian forgiveness. That's not Christian acceptance and stuff, because you're accepting other than God, right, in your house. So that's not allowed. That's not. God has specifically said that you should not have anyone but me. um what did you find of this interfaith thing? When did it start, and
Mm.
why are more and more priests not against this? Like, why is it just being accepted?
It goes back to a clash between relativism and absolutism. One of the things that happened, I think, in the 19th century, as people discovered that science produced a more complex picture, it diluted their confidence, if they had any, the Judeo-Christian revelation, and this made it easier for a relativistic worldview to come in material and political and historical terms. But what relativism does, of course, is it undermines the claims of religion, and so relativists then relativized Christianity, and they misunderstood Islam, and they treated it as an Abrahamic religion,
Mm.
which it isn't, because all the figures in Islam who sound as though they're similar are in fact different. It's a different Abraham, a different Isa, a different Miriam. They're not the same character, although they bear the same names or Arabized
But their
names.
nature is completely
Their
different.
nature's completely
Yeah.
exactly so. So these rather silly people, uneducated people, got bamboozled by the similarity of the names. not noticing the nature was different. So the nature begins with Allah. Allah
Mm.
is not Yahweh.
Yeah.
Allah is, you can't know Allah. He's an unknowable force. He requires submission. Such forgiveness as he offers is not on the basis that Yahweh gives it. He doesn't ever become your father in the intimate Abba that Jesus offers. And so a mixture of ignorance and relativism meant that people thought that Islam was a form of occluded Christianity, whereas it worships a different God altogether. And people became embarrassed by the claims of Jesus to be the way, the truth, and the life, because to accept that you have to know him. But
Mm.
you can follow, if you like, a religious culture without coming into a living relationship with the God behind it. And it's the difference in formal religion
Mm.
and authentic religion. So, unfortunately, a mixture of the power of relativism and an ignorance of what Islam really was um, pushed this interfaith movement. And essentially, what it means is that Christians surrender to Islam because Islam doesn't have that relativism in it. It's a very powerfully absolutist religion,
Yep.
it doesn't compromise. It requires everything to submit to its understanding, and unfortunately, Muslims knew their own faith better than the secularized Christian educational establishment. And every time people like me would say to them, "Look, you're misunderstanding Islam. You haven't read the Quran. You don't know what the ambitions of Islam are. You are recreating Islam in your own defunct image of
Mm.
of Christianity." And but they found it very difficult to believe they were ignorant and mistaken. People don't like it when you tell them they're ignorant and mistaken. They
Yeah.
it, it, anyways. So
How come, like, the priests themselves, they should know Christianity, even
they,
if they don't know Islam, they should know Christianity. How can they agree to interfaith projects, not just with Islam, with any other religion?
well, unfortunately, our priests are also ignorant and mistaken. And the thing about being a Christian is it's a journey into a deeper relationship with God that requires a constant dying.
Mm.
This is what I think what Jesus meant when he said, "If you want to follow me, you have to pick up your cross daily and follow me." So there
Mm.
is a constant death of the ego and of the will and of a worldview, because God has to reformat us, recreate us, and He has to do it by us
Mm.
allowing Him to do it, and it's quite painful. Um, and this way of painful surrender isn't what everyone chooses when they become Christians, including,
Mm.
people become clergy for different reasons. Some of them want status, some of them don't want to work in a normal job, some of them are therapists with spirituality. A whole series of reasons why people become Christians. And unfortunately, the Church of England, as a secular experiment, became a very bad gatekeeper of its ordained clergy.
Mm.
And when you combine that with this very decadent relativist educational tradition that we've had really since the First World War, it's meant that Christianity and the state church have fallen into a kind of corruption. And this corruption's created a vacuum, and this vacuum has walked Islam.
Mm. Mm. And, like, because it brings me to that the threats that Islam brings to the West is, it's not people need to understand, it's not just that they will become the dominant religion, is that everything that West has built will be lost,
Yes,
or will have to go underground and wait for a resurgence, and that will have to be a direct conflict with Islam, right? Because they will not they are, if anyone in the West needs to understand, they are like the communists, so they need total control, they need total power, they need total surveillance of everything. Otherwise, if there's no fear, there's no submission, as the word of Islam actually means, submission, not love. You know, unless they have that, because they don't have anything else, so they will have to destroy everything. That's why whenever they go into a civilization, they can't. When Christianity went to other civilization, it didn't destroy their things. It asked them to come to them instead, right? A willingness, like you have to come to Christ. You can't, Christ cannot be imposed upon you, otherwise it would not be honest.
Right.
But Islam doesn't do that. Islam goes in just like communists. They go in, they destroy you, they break your connection with your heritage, so that they can jump in and they can put in their mythologies, and they can tell you how Isa is the same as Christ, how this is the same as that. Like, see, oh, they told the Hindus, oh yeah, one of your Hindu gods, they spoke about Muhammad thousands of years ago. See, Muhammad, like, they is all communist tactics.
It is. Well, I try and explain it to people sometimes as the difference between Mecca and Medina, because
Mm,
again, very few people, very few Christians and very few secularists have any understanding of the history of Islam or the life of Muhammad. And so
mm,
in Mecca, Muhammad sets out to give some expression to the spirituality of his encounter with these angels, whoever they are.
mm,
And we know in terms of the satanic verses that Muhammad himself had moments of anxiety and doubt as to where he was getting the voices from. But in Mecca, he tries, if you like, the Jewish and the Christian pattern of
mm,
negotiation and communication and diplomacy, and it fails completely.
mm,
And he gets very angry and cross and frustrated. He leaves and he goes to Medina as a warlord. He moves
mm,
from being a prophet to being a warlord, and in Medina he takes over and he uses force. And what Muhammad discovers is that force works much better than negotiation. And so Islam takes off when he uses force, and it becomes it. It's represented by the second half of the Quran, which, as we know, takes precedence over the first half of the Quran in terms of the way Quranic interpretation works. And so Islam becomes a politicized religion requiring submission and force. And people don't understand. And that's one of the reasons why there's no moderate Islam. Because if
mm,
you like, if people say, well, I know, let's take the moderate Islam, the moderate prophet of Medina, of Mecca rather,
mm,
and live out of that. The answer is, well, anybody who instead uses the latter half of the Quran, where the violence and the force is,
mm,
it takes precedence. It's a principle of abrogation. This is the
mm,
interpretation of the Quran. What comes later takes precedence. So
mm.
Medina came later, force comes later, compulsion comes later. Force and compulsion, therefore, have a higher currency than negotiation
Yeah.
and spirituality. And if people understood that, they would know that they're dealing with the Muhammad from Medina, not Muhammad from Mecca.
Yeah.
He's very often presented as the Muhammad from Mecca, and
But people
until
also don't realize that the Quran, like the way it is presented right now, is not in order of
right,
revelation.
right,
It was reorganized. If you read in the order of revelation, you get complete
very
different view
different
of what
impression.
Islam is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and there
So
is no moderation. Like, you're right to say that, because I've been saying it for so long as well. Like, I understand. Like, okay, in theology there is no moderation. In reality, they are moderate Muslims, right? So, if we
yes,
separate those two, like, yeah, there are people who act out moderately their religion, but it doesn't mean that they are the rule. They are not. They are the exception to the rule, because in Quran, Allah has said Himself. There's a surah of Al Munafiqeen. Munafiq is someone who is a hypocrite, who says they follow Islam but does not follow them properly. And Allah has said specifically in the Quran, He's saying to Prophet Muhammad, He's saying, you might be able to forgive them, but I will never forgive them. So this is a very unforgiving God. This is one of the verses as well, which made me leave Islam itself, because I was like, well, nobody tells me what to do. You know?
yes.
But-
Well, you're right, and the problem is, and again, people don't understand this because they meet moderate Muslims and they're very nice
Mm,
people, and moderate Islam is a congenial way of life. But what they
mm,
don't understand is that there is a rigorous Islam, and the
yeah.
moment rigorous Islam is preached or taught or threatened or encouraged, it takes precedence over moderate
Yeah.
Islam. If you have a moderate interpretation of Islam and a rigorous interpretation, the rigorous one always wins. And
Yeah.
so, in any kind of public
Mm,
discussion between Islamic scholars or between uh, cultural Muslims,
mm,
you never hear the moderate Islamic voice take precedence. It's
yeah.
always the rigorous one, and of course, this is presented as radicalization. But this is a terrible misrepresentation. Muslims are
No.
not being radicalized. They're simply being invited to live deeper, more authentic Islamic
Yeah.
lives.
It's
It's
just
the
the
rigorous
religion is
path.
radical
It's just,
itself.
that's right. The religion is radical. To be a Muslim
Yeah.
is to be radicalized. It's tautological.
Yeah, and this is what I try telling people as well. Like, okay, you might have, because a lot of people over here, they really annoy me when they say, "Oh, but my moderate Muslim friend is like, I don't
Yeah,
really care about your moderate Muslim friend,
that's right.
because your friend might be moderate Muslim. There is no guarantee that your moderate Muslim son and daughter will be moderates. All they have to do is read the Quran and the Sunnah and follow the teachings properly. That's all they have to do. Is
Well,
they all they have to do is to have to be good Muslims,
absolutely.
and that's it.
Inflamed by a bit of resentment,
Hmm.
misunderstanding, and anger with the host religion. And then the answer, the solution, or if you like, the panacea to the resentment, is rigorous Islam, which is a very satisfying way of dealing with it. But you're absolutely right. Moderate Islam is a form of temporary, if you like, a sort of form of religious procrastination.
Hmm.
But behind it always comes rigorous Islam, which says enough
Yeah.
of this now. This is not acceptable to Allah. What is acceptable to Allah is the more rigorous implementation of the Quranic
Hmm.
verses, and to which there is no moderate answer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, because a lot of moderate Muslims, they are moderates because they don't know the religion themselves. They don't know Islam properly, and that's why they can't hold Islam. That's why there's no debates of moderate Muslims between with Islamic scholars, because they won't win, and because they'll be scared for their life, because if they misrepresent, they know they're going to get killed for blasphemy or whatever. So you can see, like, even though it might exist in a person, the moderation in a system of Islam, it doesn't work, because they just get killed off.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think so the Western mind just cannot understand. And when they come to deal with it, it seems to me like what's happening now is they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That when they're like, okay, just get rid of all of them. It's like, you have to deal with ideology separate to people, because as Christians, this is why there's a need for Christian revival, because as Christians we should be in the business of reviving their souls, of saving their soul.
Mm.
So we should be attacking the ideology so that we can save the Muslims from the fate of hell that they are going towards, and bring them to Christianity. That should be the sort of ethos behind it. But rather than just, oh, like, we go back to what, civil war and stuff like that. Well, that might happen, but that shouldn't be the intention from the get-go.
No, indeed, and I find it's usually not very helpful in conversations. I find to talk about Islam and Christianity to people, because they're both such enormous concepts,
Hmm.
so many different variations. People can't get their heads around them. I find it better to talk about Jesus and Muhammad, and
Yeah.
simply say, well, here are two inspirational figures. They're both very powerful in the
Hmm.
imagination. They both have enormous influence on whole civilizations, but you have to choose between them. And
Hmm.
if you don't, if you reject Jesus, you will get Muhammad. But you
Yeah.
could decide you don't want Muhammad because you like the things that Jesus brings. After all, Jesus doesn't kill his enemies and doesn't force them into submission. He makes friends of his enemies, and
Yeah.
he raises them to life. Jesus is not a warlord. He's a healer
Yeah.
of the soul. Uh, and it seems to me that if you present human beings with the choice of the real Muhammad and the real Jesus, Jesus is simply very
Yeah.
attractive and meets the need of the hunger of the human soul. And much simpler to do that than to invite people to try and grasp the complexities of the whole
Oh, yeah.
systems
Yeah.
of Islam and Christianity. But I
Yeah.
think one of the things we have to do as Christians is we have to be much more explicit about why we love Jesus and why we
Exactly.
follow
Yeah.
Jesus. And then
Hmm.
there's the $64,000 hidden trump card, which is, of course, that Jesus is alive and real and still at work. But
Hmm.
Muhammad isn't. The
Hmm.
memory of Muhammad is, but Muhammad himself isn't. And the most exciting thing is when Muslims who are genuinely hungry for God encounter Jesus in their dreams or in visions.
Hmm.
And we seem to be living in a period of time, particularly in North Africa at the moment, where people talk about. I met the most wonderful Islamic terrorist who was in the Far East. He committed a terror action, and he was in prison and going to be executed. And one night Jesus met him in the cell. He met the risen Christ and was converted on the spot. He's now a Canadian pastor in
Mm,
America, um, and to hear him talk about his movement from collaboration with Muhammad to being in love with Jesus, who met him in the
mm,
middle of the night in the cell, is really quite wonderful. And you say, well, if that's Jesus, then that's a very that's a very attractive person
yeah.
to meet.
I believe in this thing. I think so. Carl Jung said how we have collective memories
Yes.
from our ancestors and stuff, and I think so. Those memories or those feelings and those emotions come back to us, especially people of the northern Arab world, right? Because
Mm.
Christianity was their religion. Like
Yeah,
they were
absolutely.
Arab
Yep.
pagans, but they were Christianity as well. The singing of the Arabic prayers in Islam is taken from the liturgical chants
Yes.
of the Coptics, right? So and they're very similar. What I like doing is I like introducing people to those similarities to show them you have a past
Mm.
which goes further beyond Islam, and see the past, see what has been taken away from you, see what you could have been,
Yes.
you know. And also when I was in Pakistan, so I would go into mosque and stuff when when I was praying with them, and I would just ask them questions. I was an atheist at that time, but
Mm.
my intention, even at that time, my intention was to save them from the fate that they were at. Now I wasn't a Christian, I was an atheist, but I still had that feeling. I wasn't a Western sort of atheist who thought like there's nothing, right? I just thought like Islam is bad, right?
Mm.
And I didn't know Christianity as well back then. So I would go and so there's a concept within Islam where you're not supposed to listen to music
Mm.
because it takes you away from the memory of God. It takes you away from God,
Mm.
so you shouldn't listen to music, right? But there's a surah within there's a few verses within a surah in Quran where Allah is saying like how He created everything, and it's incumbent about on you to enjoy the things that He has created for you. So I would ask people that, like, so do you not think Allah has created music? So why would Allah not want you to enjoy music? You know, just to just to show them the contradiction,
Mm.
just to make them think and stuff like that. I found that more effective because like I'll leave them with that thought and see where it goes. And hopefully if they connect it with their past, with the things, and now I think like if I bring up the parables and the stories and other things of Christianity,
Mm.
then people will sort of make the connection, which is better, which is a better way of life. I just want them to get away from Islam, whatever path they choose, for starters. For starters, to get away from it, because even for the people in India, if they go towards the true Hinduism, that path is a lot better for them than to go to Islam. That's what I feel like. Those people, a lot of people in Arab, I see, I don't know how many, but a lot of people in Arab are converting to Christianity from Islam. And I think so it is those ancestral memories that come up in dreams, and that connection to dreams, and especially when they get to like that Islamic terrorist, when they get to act out Muhammad and they don't find Muhammad
Mm.
like Jesus. And then when Jesus represents himself to them in their dreams, because of whatever reason, for a Christian, you would say like Christ appeared to him. Someone else can say it's the ancestral knowledge that is reappearing in itself, because they're in conflict in their mind about the actions that they're doing and knowing that they're not good actions. So is that a wisdom of the ancestors that is coming up to them and telling them like there's a better path? I
That's
think so
very
that plays out a lot.
yes. Well, you're right, and these are complicated concepts.
Mm,
The collective unconscious, the wisdom of the ancestors, the work of the Holy Spirit. I'm prone to be a form of Christian Neoplatonist, because I think perhaps the soul even remembers and is hungry
Mm,
for aspects of heaven that we have forgotten as we became human. But
that's a good
uh,
concept. Yeah.
but you're right. There is this
Mm,
constant hunger for God, and one of the things that we have to do, why we all have to be evangelists, is to remind our society of what they are
yeah.
hungry for and what they could have. I think it's a lovely idea to invite people to go before the formal recognition of Quranic verses and say, well, but to invite them to have a systematic theology of God the
Mm,
Creator.
yeah. I mean, and like, and also move beyond that point that Christianity is not bricks and mortar. It's not the church that has been built. It goes beyond it. And now most of us in the West are literate. You can pick up the Bible and you
Mm,
can understand. We have more IQ than we used to have before, even though we are not exhibiting that IQ. But we have more
mm.
capacity to think, to understand. We have more. You know we have more access to knowledge, we have more access to people now. We can reach our, even our priests, like those who know
Mm.
Christianity, through like even the internet. We don't have to go there physically. So because I'm saying that because a lot of people, when I say to them Christianity needs to be revived in England, they say, well, the Church of England has fallen.
Mm.
And the Catholic Church, to a point as well, is putting in things like the recent point of not using before Christ but using before Common Era. These are subversive things that are entering in, so they feel like and they point out to the people who acted out badly, like the priest, the Catholic priest, who were you know acted out as pedophiles and stuff like that. But I try to tell them, like, it's beyond the people. The Christian, like, the wisdom of Christianity is beyond the people, is beyond the Church of Christ. Like, there are churches who are still true, and you can go to those churches, but you can also try to just understand the wisdom and act out.
I think there's a real difference between the Catholic Church and the Church of England. I
Mm,
would say that, but I've known them both. I'm afraid the Church of England has fallen because it has no real resistance to the spirit of the age, and it's essentially a
mm,
political creation designed
mm,
to
yeah.
bring stability to the state. It's true the Catholic Church is also experiencing the same struggle with the zeitgeist, which is and those rather silly church bureaucrats who've given way over BCE are just
Mm,
silly people who'll be get rid of, and that. But the Catholic Church itself won't give way. The paedophile priests are not so much a flaw within Catholicism, but an example of the infiltration of homosexuality. The greater
mm,
part of them were homosexuals. Homosexual predatoriness is very dangerous, and the Catholic Church lowered its guard and let in a generation of predatory homosexual priests. But it's beginning to deal with it. It has the capacity to renew itself in a
mm,
way that the Church of England, I think, is past. But all Christianity and all Christians are in need of constant renewal because there is no steady state of spiritual journey. We are always fighting, if you like, against spiritual gravity. The devil
mm,
will always pull us down. Our sins will always pull us down. Our entropy will always wear us out. Um, to go on the Christian journey with Christ is to need renewal in the Holy Spirit every single day to
mm.
help us with the spiritual struggle of the death of the ego and crucifixion.
But
So
it is a journey, right? So it
it
is
is
a
a
journey,
journey,
and every
absolutely.
day you need to refresh yourself. You
And you
need to
go you
keep
go down or
thinking.
you go up.
Yeah,
You don't go along.
yeah. There's one last question that I wanted to ask you, because you've been in part of both the churches
Mm,
in your life. There's one thing that I find odd about, like, obviously, because I don't know the reason for it within the Catholic Church, is of the priests being celibate. Because I always feel like, if you have a family as a priest, if you, or as a leader of the community and stuff, you're better placed to give good advice to people, to marriage counsel, and like to your community, and be better person to your community. It keeps you honest as well. It keeps you it's a better way of keeping away from a lot of the ills, and the temptations. Why is Catholic Church on that side of
So
like
this
demanding
is a very interesting question. So first of all, a priest is not called to be a therapist, so
Mm,
he's not an advice giver. You can go to therapists for that.
mm,
And secondly, uh, being married doesn't necessarily make you an expert on human relations or on sexuality.
mhm.
There are good marriages and bad marriages. But if first of all, there are plenty of married priests in the Catholic Church.
Okay.
It's just not the norm. So the Eastern Rite, they have them, and the Ordinariate, they have them. They're not forbidden. It's just they're not the cultural norm. The main reason
So
is that
it's not forbidden, like as it.
no, it's not dogma. It's not
Okay,
dogma. It's
okay.
it's cultural practice. Um,
Yeah.
the main
That makes
reason.
me like Catholic a bit more now. Feel
the,
more comfortable.
the main reason is that the Catholic priest is called to be like Jesus,
Mm,
and he marries the church in the same way that Jesus is married to the
mm,
church. I was very critical of. I thought celibacy was an overreaction until I saw what the 20th century did. Sex is immensely powerful, and we
mm,
live in a period when the last 100 years sexual addiction has overtaken secular culture. And what I thought was an overreaction in Catholicism now seems to me to be a sensible way of balancing and taming the sexual appetite. So, not everyone is called to be a priest, but those
mm,
who are married to the church in the same way that Jesus was married to
mm,
the church. It's undoubtedly true, as St. Paul said, that if you marry, you develop a whole series of commitments
mm,
to your wife, to the children, to your family and the community, and this take up a good deal of your energy and your attention. The great gift of being a celibate priest is that you give the whole of yourself to
okay.
this
Yeah,
imago
makes
Christi,
sense.
and
Mm,
it's not compulsory, but
mm,
I think I would rather be in a church that practiced celibacy, where I've seen a degree of holiness and commitment and single-mindedness and an antidote to sexual addiction
mm,
take place, than I would be in a church that didn't practice celibacy, where I see clergy behaving like therapists, like teachers, like managing directors, indistinguishable from anybody else. And so,
mm.
if you have to choose between the two, then I think the I
Yeah,
think the sexual continence of Catholicism, the capacity to deal with this appetite, is more impressive than not dealing with the appetite.
yeah. No, I think so. It makes sense. I think so. I was thinking from the probably from my like mindset or point of view as well. So I remember me being a bit promiscuous, and not being the like having more desires and stuff like that,
Yes, yes,
lust and desire and stuff,
it's very
till I
masculine.
actually, yeah, yeah. till I actually met my wife, and I fell in love with her
Yes,
almost 13 or so years ago. And then, like, yes, I have those feelings, but only towards her, and I
yes,
generally don't have anything for anyone else, because in my mind is completely, the sexual desire is completely related to love,
yes,
right?
yes,
Without it, it doesn't make sense to me.
yes.
Without
Well,
it, it seems like a animalistic sort of
it is.
behavior.
It's exactly what it
And
is. Yes,
it's actually made me more spiritual in that sense. It's made brought a lot of balance to my life. uh, being in love with my wife and renewing that love every sort of day, every time that I see
mm.
her, like, that sort of thing. But that's why it's very important what you said. It's not forbidden, and it's a path that everyone has to choose separately, but it's not the norm. It's a.
It is. I mean, if you're in love with your wife and you
Mm,
have a faithful monogamous relationship with her,
mm,
there's very little better than that. But one should remember that sex is not an easy or terribly successful thing. And one of
yeah,
the things that's happened in our society is that an awful number of people stop having sex in their marriages.
mm,
It simply doesn't work for them anymore. If you like, the animalistic fantasy dies
yeah,
away. And so there are two ways of dealing with this. One is to go and feed it artificially with pornography or
mm,
with other women you're not going to commit
yeah.
to. and the
Yeah.
other is to let it lie fallow. But I think what I'm trying to say is that the the presentation of sex as something we absolutely have to have
Mm.
is misleading. There's no doubt at all that if you're a young man with full of testosterone, then the
Mm.
impression is you'll tell
Yeah.
yourself you have to have it and get as much of it as you possibly can. But
Yeah.
it's not entirely true. Sexuality is much more complex than that. It
Mm.
changes throughout life, and
But
and
it
it
has a tendency of bringing these selfish desires, right? So most
yeah,
of the time, what I see, even within marriages where people stop having sex and stuff, is because they're only looking for their selfish desires, their selfish needs, and they become disconnected
it
with the
becomes
person that they.
right, and it can become quite hard work in a marriage. Quite
Yeah.
it's quite sacrificial. You may
Mm.
have to put in a lot of time, attention, and loving care. Because it changes from the animalistic fantasy thing. The
Mm.
animalistic fantasy thing is really quite dangerous.
Yeah.
But once one gets beyond that,
Mm.
then the way in which one expresses sexuality becomes complex and multivariate. And in that sense, also celibacy uh, celibacy is a good, perfectly acceptable, steady state for those who have the gift for it. But you can
Mm.
only practice it if you have the gift or the calling. It would be quite
Yeah.
wrong, which is one of the reasons why it was so completely wrong to ordain homosexual predators who had no gift for
Yeah.
celibacy at all into
Mm.
the priesthood. It was a terrible thing to do, and
Yeah.
it's caused unimaginable damage to people.
Yeah, and unimaginable damage to the reputation of like the church as well,
Yeah,
and
I'm afraid so.
it's one of the main reasons why I feel like in England and in Ireland people have gone away from
Of
Christianity is
course,
because of those scandals,
of course.
rather than like Christianity itself, because they just can't find a way to justify it. Like there's no justification for those actions.
No, but I think they mistake the cause. I mean, I would
Mm,
lay the
mm,
cause at the root
yeah.
of masculine appetite. It's
Mm,
male appetite, and there's a certain kind of homosexual male appetite which is pedophilic or phobophilic, the adolescent stage. And instead of saying this was the invasion of homoerotic pedophilia into the church, people say, "Oh,
mm,
this is Catholicism. This is priesthood." No, it
mm,
isn't at all. It was the church capitulating to something that invaded from outside.
yeah.
And so I think if we're going to deal with the perverting danger, the danger comes from unrestrained masculine sexual appetite.
Mm,
That's where we should lay the blame.
yeah.
We should keep unrestrained masculine sexual appetite out of the
And
priesthood.
it's important you say that, because I can hear what people will be saying right now. Oh yeah, but there's a lot of straight people who are pedophiles as well. There's a lot of like not all gay people are
Fewer.
pedophiles. Like
No,
no, no, no.
it's fewer. No, it's really fewer. This is
Yeah,
one of the
it
things
doesn't
that's
take
happened in our
everyone to do the. It takes minority to
people.
do this.
People are going to get very cross with this, but
Yeah,
of course there are straight paedophiles. I mean, of course there are, and
yeah.
they should be held accountable for what they
Mm,
do. Uh, in fact, I mean, there are arguments that Muhammad's fascination with a 9-year-old bride and the way in which some Muslims replicate that is an aspect of paedophilia. But let's not go there. As
yeah.
part of that, undoubtedly, there's straight paedophilia and there's gay paedophilia.
Mm,
Within the Catholic Church, gay paedophilia was far more prevalent. And
mm,
therefore, one has to say it's the gay paedophiles who are accountable for it. They didn't become paedophiles by becoming priests.
yeah.
They were paedophiles
They people. Yeah, important.
before they were let in.
The
Um,
prerequisite of letting them in, that's the
that was a
criteria,
that was a
that's the
mistake.
thing that needs to be tackled. Like
Yes,
that was at fault, not the Christ was not at fault, the
absolutely
religion was not at fault, is the church is failing to not recruit the right people.
right. And it's not the church's failing. In the set, it's not the church's philosophical failing. The
Mm-hmm.
church says if you become a priest, you abstain from sex. It doesn't
Yeah.
say you abstain from sex with women, but you can have it with boys. It,
Mm. Yeah.
at no
Yeah.
point has the church ever said that.
Yeah.
In fact, quite the opposite. Jesus is very clear that if you cause children to sin, you are in danger of the most serious judgment. The
Mm.
church's theory is always good. The church's practice in allowing
Mm.
straight and gay paedophiles in was very badly flawed. But it gave way to the 20th century. It was in the 20th century that an eruption of sexual appetite
Yeah.
developed. And this dreadful idea of Freud's that if you didn't somehow give in to your sexual appetites, you would become neurotic or unbalanced.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, we have a lot to blame Freud for,
yeah.
and the 20th century liked Freud's ideas so much that it brought them
That took
wholesale.
away the concept of moderation, of
Yeah.
self-control, of
Yes.
self-responsibility. It's like, oh no, you have to give in to this.
Absolutely.
Like, I always found that idea so ridiculous. It's like you encouraging people to give in to the desires, rather whether they are good for them or not, because probably it was him projecting his own, neurosis on people. Like,
Of course it was.
yeah.
He was utterly preoccupied with sex, but
Hmm,
nowhere within the Catholic Church's tradition, nowhere within its theology of holiness or priesthood, is there any acknowledgement that by giving into your
hmm,
desires you are doing something acceptable. It's exactly the opposite. It's the
hmm,
Catholic Church that has produced some of the most extraordinarily powerful saints
hmm,
because they were people who knew how to deal with their appetites and their lower natures. The Catholic Church is actually the expert at
hmm,
producing holy and transformed people. It's just
hmm.
a complete tragedy that you hear more about the paedophiles than you hear about the saints.
Yeah, but obviously, like, theory in Christianity is from God, but practice is human,
Yeah,
so there
exactly.
will be flaws in practice.
Or as St. Paul said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I won't take up too much of your time now. Thank you
Thomas,
so
it's
much
great
for
to talk
coming
to you.
on.
No, a
It
pleasure.
was so wonderful. I would like to talk to you again whenever you have
Let's do
time.
that. Love
Yeah,
to. Great.
it
Real
was
pleasure.
brilliant.
Pleasure to meet you. And thank you for sharing your own journey too, which I found really
Oh,
fascinating.
thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, everyone. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.
God bless you. Bye bye.